Mega Man 2 began with an amazing cutscene, giving some context to the adventure that follows. But when you first load up Mega Man 3, on the other hand, you just jump right into the level select screen. And to make things even better, if you look between the portraits of Top Man and Shadow Man on this screen over here, you will notice there is actually some screen tearing. I thought this was a problem with the Legacy Collection, but apparently the game was released like this, so you already know we're in for a good time. Like Mega Man 2, 3 also had a rushed development cycle, but in 3's case, Capcom was really demanding that the devs put out this game as soon as possible, even though they were not satisfied with where it was at. So this time around, you can really notice the jank. For instance, in this moment, I somehow clipped into a wall, and I never experienced a glitch like that in the other ones. But you know what? In spite of this jank, I actually don't think Mega Man 3 is a bad game. In my opinion, it does a lot of good things as well. So far we're 2 for 2 on good Mega Man games with a lot of problems, so why not add a third one to that list? I guess the first thing I should talk about is the brand new mechanic added to this game. On top of the already established controls, you can now slide by holding the down arrow when you jump. While sliding, you go faster, and I mean way faster, to the point where it's more efficient to travel by sliding than running. You can also stop on a dime, meaning if you're skilled enough and fully memorized all the levels, it's strictly beneficial to slide. Unfortunately, the momentum of your slide does not carry over to your jumps, so it won't necessarily help you do platforming. But it does help you outrun certain enemies, giving a lot of versatile combat applications. Another feature of the slide is that it shrinks your hitbox. During a slide, you can go beneath some enemies and slide under narrow ceilings. The devs very deliberately designed enemies and levels around this mechanic to create a whole lot of instances where you're incentivized to slide. For me, this was a very welcome addition, because it adds a new layer of skill and mastery to the game. The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to Mega Man 3 is something I really haven't talked about much at all so far. Something very prevalent throughout the entire Mega Man series, that being the notion of boss order. I did discuss how Mega Man as a series lets you take on levels in any order you'd like, and how that non-linear approach is one of its strengths that makes each run unique. But I failed to mention there is a notion that many people seem to have regarding the Mega Man games, which is that there is only one correct order to tackle each of the levels. That order is the intended order, and you should look it up before you play a Mega Man game. I think that this is very incorrect, because in a lot of Mega Man games, that isn't really the case at all. There are plenty of levels you can do first, which is why the level select screen is made open in the first place. Furthermore, if you actually look at boss patterns, it's pretty clear that they were made with the Mega Buster in mind, because you won't even get to see most of their attacks and patterns if you kill them with their weakness, since, weaknesses tend to kill bosses in a matter of seconds. But still, in some of these early games especially, it is extremely difficult to defeat bosses without their weaknesses. And so I think the reason for this perception existing in the first place is the way you're supposed to fight some of these bosses is just very poorly communicated to the player, to the point where there's an assumption that their difficulty is purely by design. And much of this is a result of the bosses being very poorly made, in my opinion. So the weapon system winds up acting as a sort of bandage to make them seem less bad than they really are. I realized after my last video that I didn't really elaborate on what I consider good boss design versus bad boss design, and as a result, I don't think I got my point across very well. So right now I'm actually going to explain why I find bosses good or bad. The main thing I look for in a good boss fight is how consistent their attack patterns are. For this example, I want to use a new robot master introduced in Mega Man 3, which is Top Man. Top Man does a spin across the screen, and the player is expected to jump over it. After the spin is over, he releases tops into the air, and these tops shoot in the direction of the player. If the player jumps the moment they're shot, they can dodge the attack successfully. He then repeats these moves infinitely until he is defeated. So you can tell the flow of fighting this boss is consistent. It just demands that you observe that very clear pattern and keep trying to pull it off. In effect, you get to learn how to fight the boss. This is what I consider good boss design. The second thing I look for in a good Mega Man boss is whether or not you can reasonably succeed in avoiding their attacks if you know what the game is communicating to you. For example, let's use Woodman from Mega Man 2. After leaves start falling, he revs up this leaf shield and he shoots it forward. But as he's revving up this shield, it's fairly cleverly communicated to the player that you can't brute force your way out of the situation because your projectiles just bounce off his shield as the animation is starting. You're left thinking about your only option, which is jumping. But I actually have yet to succeed in jumping over these leaves despite it coming close many times, because the timing of the jump is just so unrealistically tight that most people just can't pull it off. I consider this bad boss design because even if you clearly understand what the game wants you to do and that is possible, actually doing it is another story. With that out of the way, there's an underlying problem that you may have noticed with most Robot Masters in these early Mega Man games, but you probably never really thought about it too hard. And that's how so many of them run into you all the time. They're always trying to zigzag across the room, so you're going to constantly collide with them. And it's very hard to just jump over them because they themselves are jumping in wild and unpredictable patterns. The contact damage is so high that it often outpaces the Mega Buster, and with your very limited movement options, a lack of wall jumping and climbing, etc., there is not much of a way to dodge the bosses consistently, and so beating them is not a skill you can learn intuitively. Unless you've literally fought them hundreds of times and know exactly when they're going to jump, you will not be able to defeat the bosses in the way they were intended to be fought. And because players have limited lives, they feel pressured to resort to using the boss's weakness to cheat the fight. As a result, they never really end up learning how to fight the boss properly. I would argue that's a fault with the game design, because the game is not communicating things well to the player. If it wanted to communicate things well, there could have been a tell. For instance, the Robot Masters could have stopped in their place and crouched before jumping. So the reason this affects Mega Man 3 in particular substantially more than the other games is the removal of difficulty settings. Because unless you were playing the original Japanese version of Mega Man 2, the normal difficulty setting allowed some leeway in how many times you could screw up with contact damage, and so beating the Robot Masters in any order was plausible. But on top of having a lot of bosses with the same problems, 3 only has what amounts to a hard mode. This means playing the game out of order is exceedingly difficult, and that works to the game's detriment a lot, as it goes against the core philosophy of how a Mega Man game is supposed to work, which is playing it in any order. To 3's credit, a lot of the boss fights are cool and interesting, like Gemini Man, who fights with a doppelganger that mirrors your attack. But unless you cheat to find out the bosses that are coded well, you will basically be setting yourself up to needlessly replay the same levels over and over again. There are also a few bosses like Shadow Man with reasonably predictable patterns, but then they have to have these random elements which upset the patterns, and that makes them inconsistent to beat. So sadly, you do have to play the game in a certain order. And it just really sucks because 2 already fixed this problem thanks to the normal mode. Now it just feels like we're taking steps backwards. As a side note, you will notice in my videos that I often throw any old weapon at bosses. That's not because I'm dumb or stupid or bad at these games, it's because I'm avoiding looking up the solution whenever possible. They don't come with the game's manuals, nor are they spoon-fed to you. So if you ask me, it's a little unfair to play these games with the assumption that you were intended to know exactly what the easiest route is. Alright, now let's talk about the weapons, because the weapons kind of determine how you play the game, and the weapons in 3 are not the same kind of weapons that 2 gave you. There's just something very different about the way they interact with levels that makes them, at least in my opinion, quite a bit inferior. The first weapon I want to talk about is 3's equivalent of Metal Blade, the Shadow Blade, which I guess is just code for shuriken. You can shoot it in any direction, but it also doubles as a boomerang. So if you're being chased, you can hit enemies tailing you by jumping over it. While it's certainly not as overpowered as the Metal Blade, there are a lot of circumstances where you may want to use it, because generally, it's just a high damage weapon. Next off, we have the Gemini Laser. You can actually do a fair amount of tricks with this one because it bounces off of walls. For instance, right here you can see I pulled off a maneuver to hit the enemy above me. but I find that using it head-on is more consistent, because it costs too much energy to fool around with, especially given how powerful it is. My personal favorite weapon in the game is the Search Snake. You can shoot out these cute little snakes, and I love it. Just like the Bubble Lead in the last game, they move across the floor, but they also climb up walls, so they're useful if enemies are standing at a different elevation than you. As you can see, 3 really good weapons, but the rest don't add a whole lot. Take for instance the Needle Cannon. It's not weak or anything, but it just shoots things straight forward like the Mega Buster, so it doesn't really change gameplay in any meaningful way. The Hard Knuckle is strong, but it's also very slow and not ideal for clearing levels. At least it's useful for breaking walls like the Crash Bomber. The Magnet Missile is a projectile that automatically hooks to hit enemies above or below it, which is amazing, but it burns through energy really fast relative to how much damage it does, so you barely get to use it at all. But then there are 2 weapons that are kind of useless entirely, those being the Top Spin and the Bozo Gun. When you're in the air, using the top spin makes you start spinning, and you can damage enemies around you in a tiny radius. There hasn't been a melee weapon like this before, so I like the idea of it. But even though it's decently strong, it's just too risky to make use of because it doesn't even give you iframes. If you use it while platforming, sometimes you just end up dying because you get sent backwards. The Bozo Gun fires an electric spark which shocks enemies, stunning them in place for a few seconds, and it doesn't really damage them. But the game's level design doesn't ever really give you a circumstance where that's necessary or even the best move, so it's entirely useless and possibly the worst weapon in the franchise. All around, I'd still call this weapon lineup pretty decent, but 2's lineup changed how the game was played in far more significant ways, so to me, while better than 1, 3 was still a downgrade to 2 in this particular area. However, the game also has a new GUI for weapon selection. This one doesn't block out your eyesight. It instead sits at the bottom of the screen displaying your lives and E-tanks in one neat spot. This GUI was a huge improvement over 2's. And there's one more thing pertaining to weapons that 3 does better than 2, that being the temporary platforms. This time around, they are all themed around Mega Man's new pet dog, Rush. You can use Rush as a spring to jump up to higher elevations and potentially grab items. He also has a submarine mode, which I only use 1 time, but hey, it's pretty neat. The most useful mode, though, is the jet mode. When Rush enters the jet mode and you jump on top of him, you can freely fly wherever you want for a shockingly long amount of time, allowing you to skip past parkour sections of levels and clear designated Rush challenges. And I'm a huge fan. This ability is just very fun to use. It really makes tackling the levels a lot more entertaining. On top of that, there are now mysterious capsules that serve as loot boxes. They drop random items. Kind of a neat addition. In 1, the soundtrack was cutesy, but Mega Man 2 shifted the direction to cool-sounding music for the most part. 3 continues that trend with cool music, and it delivers very well in that department. Here are some sample tracks. To me, this music was almost on par with Mega Man 2, and 3's art was just as solid. So all around, the presentation of the game remains great. As for the game's length, it actually is the longest of the first 3, taking me over 3 hours to complete. So with all that in mind, it's about time we talk about levels. And how are the Robot Master levels this time? Do we finally have 8 really good and fun levels to play? Well, actually, no. Most of these levels are pretty strictly a downgrade from 2 in every conceivable way. Even 1's level design was stronger. The thing is, 3's levels have kind of lost the general idea of what makes a Mega Man level. There's no cohesion to them as geographic locations anymore. Take for instance Iceman's level in 1. We can see that we start off in a snowy beach, then we cross a snowy lake, then finally we drive into an icy cavern only to confront an Eskimo robot. It makes sense, right? Now look at Gemini Man's stage in 3. You run over a patch of what looks like crystals. After your tsundere brother breaks a hole in the cavern, you shoot giant frog eggs and have to destroy flying tadpoles. After crossing a lake with giant penguin robots, you reach a boss who is a robot that shadow clones himself and shoots lasers. This is not a geographic location anymore. This is an acid trip. And this isn't a one-off thing either. The levels in this game just don't work on a logical level. Shadow Man's level is lava-themed, but it isn't a mountain or a volcano, it's a factory. Are they producing lava? I don't know. Top Man's level is a greenhouse, I guess, but that's not how greenhouses look. That's all superficial stuff though, right? How do the levels play? Well, they're still the weakest, and for a few reasons. As with Mega Man 1, we once again have a lot of enemies that appear out of literally nowhere and blindside you, only this time they can also pull off the lovely air hit that one-shots you down a bottomless pit. Something that happens in several levels, and on top of being back to one's inferior style of enemies, there are enemies that like to swarm you in really crazy angles, and without any leaf shield equivalent, they're basically guaranteed to deal damage. In fact, there are a lot of sequences in the game where you just can't realistically avoid taking damage, like any mandatory rush jet section. There are some really awesome enemy ideas here, like this armadillo porcupine thing that spins towards you periodically, but the way they were implemented makes them near impossible to hit. Magnet Man's stage had these magnet-shaped enemies that carry you beneath them, and they had so much potential to be utilized in the stage. And then they just weren't. It wound up defaulting to the old block trick instead. That's right, the lovely parkour rooms with disappearing blocks are back for a third time. Bet you weren't expecting that. And now they have an even more painful gimmick where the game decides to magnetize you in a certain direction during the parkour. A lot of platforms and stages are kind of just haphazardly placed to make you use rush, while it makes a lot of them look unnatural like you're playing test levels. But weirdly enough, in spite of that, I still find all the levels decently fun. There's just enough creativity and coolness to them where I don't feel bored or super frustrated. And the inherent strangeness of how they look and how their mechanics are, for some reason, is just plain entertaining. When I saw these tops race through the screen in Top Man's stage and immediately knew what the game wanted me to do, I thought it was so cool. When I saw the flying tadpoles coming from the eggs, I had a good laugh, and I also enjoyed interacting with the level. So in a weird way, the bizarreness of these levels makes them enjoyable, but only to some extent. And as I said at the beginning of the video, the level design does encourage handling the game's mechanics well, in that it forces you to use slide in very precise and creative ways. There are even enemies that throw chains or attacks at weird angles to get you to dodge underneath them. A couple of levels are actually pretty good. I dare say they live up to 2 standards. Snake Man's level, for instance, really runs with the snake theme and creates some incredibly creative set pieces that demand you to play with genuine skill. The walls are snakes, the floor is snakes, and the enemies are snakes. It's my favorite level in this game. Needleman's level is a city, and then a pirate ship that has cannons which shoot at you. I don't get it, but I kind of like it. A lot of people seem to think that Keiji Inafune is the one responsible for Mega Man, but in reality the creator of Mega Man was a man named Akira Kitamura. I vaguely brought up things he said in an interview during my last couple of videos. The thing is, Kitamura was intimately involved with the level design and enemy placement in the first 2 Mega Man games. By the time the 3rd game was in production, he had already left the team, so that might explain why there was such a jarring shift in direction in these levels. But before he left, he told the team something interesting. If the Mega Man series was to go into a 3rd game, it should do 3 things. 1. Don't mess with the core gameplay much. You can clearly see Mega Man 3 respects this wish, but a lot of people feel that this kind of makes the game feel stale, like it's doing more of the same. So was this really the best direction? I don't know. The second thing he wanted was for items 1 to 3 to become Mega Man's dog, which again happened. And the third thing he asked for was to feature Dr. Light No. 0 as Mega Man's mysterious brother, and thus was born the most cool and interesting part of Mega Man 3's Robot Master levels, the appearance of Proto Man. Proto Man is indeed very mysterious. Whenever he is about to appear, some whistle plays in the background, and then he beams in. Because this happens every time he shows up, it quickly becomes iconic, and so you know exactly what's about to happen by the second time. Proto Man does one of 2 things, depending on the level. Either he duels you and then yeets, or he helps you clear a stage. I really like this touch. So you clear these levels, and what do you get? Well, you actually have to replay 4 of them now. Only this time, they are remixed to have new and harder features. Some extra challenge levels, a neat and interesting idea. But then you also have to fight 2 bosses in each of these stages, and they're just reusing the old AI of every single Mega Man 2 boss. In concept, this sounds quite awesome. You get the best of both adventures. But in practice, given the game only has 1 difficulty setting, and you now have 8 new weapons you need to guess between to defeat them, the actual process of fighting most of these AIs ends up causing a whole lot of deaths and game overs. Because remember, the AI of these bosses is actually pretty problematic. They were balanced out by the old difficulty curve, so it was easier to overlook the problems with their AI in 2. In 3, you can't do that because the contact damage is jacked up, so you absolutely need to find their new weaknesses to even stand a chance. And to make matters worse, the middle boss doesn't even have a respawn point, so you have to constantly grind out the level. Who thought this was a good idea? By the end of these 8 boss fights, against bosses I already fought, I was really starting to get frustrated with this game. I was even starting to dislike it. After one final showdown with Proto Man, something happened that had me really concerned. I reached more Wily levels. If you remember, in Mega Man 2, I really hated the way these levels were executed to the point that they made the game a lot worse for me. So at this point in the video, you're probably wondering why I said I liked the game. But, to my surprise, 3 randomly decides it wants to start being a good game once you reach these levels. And oh my god, these Wily levels are so much better than any of the other levels in the game, to the point where it's not even close. In fact, these levels are easily the best levels in any of these first 3 Mega Man games. They're not easy by any means. In a lot of ways, they're as hard as 2's, but unlike 2's, that challenge isn't created with weapon energy shortages or cheap shots that you can't see coming. In fact, 3 supplies you with an overabundance of weapon energy throughout all of the Wily levels, as if to acknowledge how much of an issue it was in the first game. So as a direct result, you can now finally enjoy using all of your tools that you've been acquiring throughout the entire game to take on different setups of enemies without having to worry about running out of weapon energy. That change alone makes it much more fun, but the list goes on. Wily Level 1 makes you use most of your weapons to reach the end in creative ways, and the boss at the end is based on Mega Man 2's second Wily Level boss. And that boss fight was extremely bad because it came out of random spots. But wait, did you see that over there? That's what we call a tell. That's right, this time they directly addressed the issue of you not being able to predict where its shots are going to come from. Because if you look at visual cues, the game now signals where the next attack is coming from, and is such a good boss fight now. Wily Level 2 tests your platforming skills, then asks you to use Rush Jet while supplying you with tons of energy to do so. Once you reach the end, you rematch against the Yellow Devil of all things from Mega Man 1. But instead of being the worst boss fight in the game, the Yellow Devil is now one of the best, because the rate at which it shoots its body parts is now much more reasonable, and you have the option to slide under them, so there's no more BS. It also has a cool new move to spice things up that makes you even more engaged, so his pattern doesn't get too repetitive. Given this version of the Yellow Devil is tankier, the fight winds up being nearly as hard, but the challenge is now a fair one, so it's just much more fun. Wily Level 3 goes into an awesome platforming section with a unique spin. It finishes with the clone fight from 1, but because there are 3 platforms and 3 Mega Man clones now, the random jumping stuff doesn't affect you nearly as much. So it's just a superior version of that boss fight with the same creative twist. Wily Level 4 is a boss rush, but there is no surprise boss at the end, which means now you get to actually enjoy the boss rush because you don't have to do it 10 times over. Once you clear it once, it's done and your progress is saved. Wily Level 5 is a tremendously creative boss fight where you have to utilize the slide and destroy the underbelly of the robot first, before attacking its top. It took me about 10 to 15 attempts, but that didn't bother me at all. There is no level before it, so getting a game over does not hurt your progress in any way, shape, or form. Because unlike 2, 3's Wily levels perceive challenge as the game being difficult, rather than the game being punishing, which is the biggest problem with 2. 2 made itself artificially hard by punishing you for dying and failing to guess weaknesses. 3, on the other hand, ends up being hard in the genuine way. I don't have to grind through platforming to get back to the challenge that I'm enjoying, and it makes my experience with the game so much better. Finally, there is one more surprise boss fight, and this one is spectacular. You actually have to fight a giant mech, and all of its attacks are really fairly made. If you Shadow Blade its top, it enters its second phase where the game doesn't tell you directly what to do. Instead, you have to analyze the room and you'll notice there's a platform. Obviously, you are meant to go there, but no weapon seems to hurt Wily. If you look carefully enough, you'll actually see there's an opening on the robot's head, and that opening is how Wily got into the robot. So if you think about it, there is one good way you could screw over Wily, and that is dumping snakes into his robot. It's so hysterical and it tops off the game so well. And with that, Mega Man 3 is over. It's a really, really bizarre game, full of so many contradictory ideas, that playing it almost feels like a fever dream. The fact that this game is so unfinished and so unpolished shows in almost every level. But strangely enough, in spite of that, I found a lot of enjoyment in this game. I would personally tie it with the other two, because even though it takes major steps backwards, it also takes the series forward with some significant improvements and additions. To me, these first 3 Mega Man games are a trio of good games with a lot of huge problems. If you go for 2, it starts off strong and finishes weak. If you go for 3, it starts weak and finishes strong. 1 is more consistently in the middle of all of that. I just find it cosmically sad that these games are all coming so close to being amazing, but then they all drop the ball in some way or another, and that ends up souring the experience as a whole. But I guess in the end, you can credit that to these being early attempts. It took Capcom a while to fully find their grounding in the series. And on that note, my next video will be covering Mega Man 4. Will it finally be the game to break the cycle? Well, I would very much appreciate it if you left a like, dropped a comment, and subscribed to my channel so that I can give you my answer. I hope you enjoyed the video, take care of yourself, and see you next time.